Hello everyone, hope you're having a great day. Today, we're going to explore a story about a man who seems strong on the outside, but is quietly hiding a secret that could change everything for the woman he loves. What happens when happiness is built on a truth that can't be spoken? If you find this interesting, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Sunlight slipped through the dusty office windows, cutting long, uneven shadows across a desk piled with documents. James stood still, phone in hand, his voice calm and controlled as he instructed an employee to photograph the technical report. Everything checked out. The building's height stayed within regulations. The walls measured exactly 50 centimeters thick. Clean, compliant, nothing for the authorities to question. On paper, it was perfect, but then the employee handed him a different stack. Old photographs, faded, slightly yellowed at the edges, childhood photos of Diep. James flipped through them slowly. Birthday snapshots, school uniforms, awkward smiles, frozen in time. And then it hit him. What wasn't there? No mother, not a single image. His fingers paused, tightening just a little around the edges of the photos. Diep's father had passed away young. That much he knew. But her mother, Diep, had left long ago, gone with another man, and was still living somewhere in Hanoi. A fact Diep didn't know. A truth James had been quietly carrying alone. The room felt heavier with every second he stared at those pictures. The secret twisted inside him, slow and sharp, like a blade he couldn't pull out. Still, his voice stayed even as he looked up and casually asked the employee to continue investigating Diep's whereabouts. Calm on the surface, unrest flickering just behind his eyes. To everyone else, James was decisive, unshakable, a leader who always knew what to do. But inside, he was a man desperately trying to bury a past that didn't belong to him, but could destroy the woman he loved. The pressure piled on. Work, the company, responsibility. And beneath it all, the constant fear that one day Diep would find out the truth on her own. He forced a polite smile, thanked the employee, and turned away before anyone could notice the storm breaking inside his chest. This secret wasn't just information. It was the fragile thread holding together his quiet happiness with Diep. One wrong move, one careless moment, and everything could unravel. The walls felt like they were closing in. Somewhere in the distance, machines hummed, their low vibration echoing his thoughts. Still, James stood tall, hiding the cracks in his calm exterior. He knew the truth he guarded had the power to shatter the peaceful life they were building. And in that moment, the gap between his public strength and private vulnerability felt sharper than ever. The small meeting room buzzed softly with turning pages and low, steady voices. James sat at the head of the table, eyes locked on the spreadsheet projected in front of him. Numbers filled the screen, neat and unforgiving. 74 workers, 21 with 3 years of service, 37 with 2, 26 with just 1. He ran the calculations carefully. TET bonuses first, 500 million, split evenly. Then additional amounts for senior staff. Total, 574 million. Clean math, no room for error. Then TET gifts, another 300 million. Should they go with cash or prepared gift baskets? As he spoke, his tone softened slightly when the topic shifted to employees who were struggling. Minor illnesses, unexpected hospital visits, quiet expenses the company had covered without fanfare. He paused mid-sentence, and glanced out the window. The sky was burning red as the sun dipped lower, painting the city in exhausted colors. For a brief moment, James wasn't just a boss reviewing budgets. He was a man who had seen too much, too many lives weighed down by circumstances they never chose. "I think I'll skip my own bonus this year," he said quietly. "There are people here who need it more than I do." The room fell still. An employee quickly scribbled notes, unaware of how deep that decision ran. James continued, voice steady but eyes distant. "I see a lot of people in tougher situations than mine." Compassion surged, cutting sharply against the cold precision of his earlier calculations. The company wasn't in an easy place financially. Every decision mattered, and yet he chose sacrifice. He chose to share. He offered a faint smile, but his gaze drifted somewhere far beyond the meeting room. He knew this city life, this world of numbers and targets, was just a shell. Real happiness wasn't here. It waited somewhere quieter, somewhere human. The fluorescent lights overhead felt colder now. The weight of leadership pressed down harder than ever. But in his quiet decision to help, something warm stirred beneath the pressure. A small belief that kindness still had a place, even in a world ruled by profit. The room felt smaller, the air thicker with unspoken gratitude. Later, neon lights flickered above a display table filled with sample Tet gift baskets. James picked up a handheld fan printed with the company logo, turned it over once, then set it aside. Next came a box of tea, then a bottle of aged wine. Each item landed in the 200,000 to 300,000 VND range, perfectly within the 300 million budget. He murmured to himself, thinking out loud, logos printed on cups, teapots, tea boxes, items people would take home, use every day. When guests visited, they'd notice. Subtle branding, simple, effective. But then he hesitated. He imagined workers traveling long distances back to their hometowns for Tet. Crowded buses, motorbikes loaded with bags, heavy gift baskets strapped awkwardly to the back. Maybe cash would be easier. James turned toward the window, watching the city pulse with restless energy. Brand visibility pulled one way. Practical care pulled another. "I'll talk to Tuan," he said finally, "and ask the workers what they actually want. No forcing, no assumptions, just listening." In that moment, he wasn't thinking like an executive chasing brand exposure. He was a man trying to balance corporate interests with genuine care. A small, tired smile crossed his lips. This city life was full of calculations, logos, budgets, strategies. And yet, he longed for a place where none of that mattered, where sincerity was enough. The decision could wait. But deep down, he already knew. Gifts weren't about the objects. They were about the thought behind them. He set the sample down, exhaled slowly, and turned back to the numbers, carrying that quiet conflict with him. By late afternoon, the world had changed. Crimson sunlight spread across wide rice fields, rippling like fire over green. James stood beside Diep, both of them gripping the wooden plow as a buffalo trudged forward, breathing heavily. Sweat darkened their shirts, dust clung to their skin. Diep laughed as she struggled to keep the plow steady. It was her first time, and she was clearly enjoying every second of it. James guided her patiently. No suits, no meetings, no Tet bonus spreadsheets, just earth beneath their feet and sky overhead. Then, without warning, Diep stopped. She turned to him, her expression serious. "You're hiding something from me, aren't you?" James felt his heart stutter. In an instant, everything rushed back. The photos, the missing mother, the truth he'd locked away. It swept through him like a cold wind across the field. He shook his head gently, forcing warmth into his voice. "No, I just love you more every day. That's probably why I sound strange." She narrowed her eyes, half joking, half serious. "Promise me, if you're hiding anything, I'll be angry. I won't play with you anymore." He nodded quickly, too quickly. His eyes flicked away for just a fraction of a second before returning to hers, sincere and steady. And in that moment, he made his choice. He chose silence. They went back to plowing, shoulders close, the doubt seemingly dissolved. But inside James, the weight grew heavier. The countryside was peaceful, quiet, everything the city wasn't. And that peace terrified him, because he knew how easily it could be lost. He tightened his grip on the plow handle, determined to hold on to this moment for as long as he could. Dust rose gently around them. The buffalo kept moving forward, and for now, the lie felt bearable beneath the open sky. They eventually rested beneath the wide shade of a banana tree at the edge of the field. An old nylon sheet was spread out on the ground, serving as their makeshift table. Simple food was laid out on top: hand-pressed rice, dried fish, and a small pile of raw bamboo shoots. Nothing fancy, nothing measured. James reached over first, naturally serving Diep before himself. His voice was low and relaxed as he said, almost to himself, "Food like this is when it tastes best." They ate with their hands. Diep laughed when she fumbled with her chopsticks and gave up, copying him instead. Bits of rice stuck to their fingers. The kind of meal that didn't care about manners, only presence. For a while, there was nothing but chewing, soft laughter, and the sound of wind brushing through the rice. Then the conversation shifted, slowly, like the sun lowering in the sky. James spoke about life, his words calm but weighted, about how nothing was guaranteed, wealth or poverty, long lives or short ones, how everything people chased could disappear overnight. He said the real hardship wasn't physical labor or getting your hands dirty, but living a life without meaning, waking up day after day, just letting time pass. Diep listened closely, her eyes focused, thoughtful. After a moment, she nodded. "I think I understand now," she said softly. "We should treasure what's happening right now." That was it. No dramatic declaration, just understanding. In that moment, James felt something deeper than excitement or passion. It was a quiet connection, a sense of being seen. He looked at her, and two emotions collided inside him: hope and regret. Hope because he wanted this life, this simplicity, this feeling. Regret because the secret was still there, heavy in his chest, refusing to fade. They continued eating, sharing the bamboo shoots, passing pieces of fish back and forth. A breeze swept across the field, carrying the scent of ripe rice and distant wood smoke. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The calculating, suffocating city versus this place that only asked you to be present. James smiled, but deep down, he knew the truth. This happiness was fragile. It existed only as long as the secret remained buried. The simple meal became a symbol of what he'd chosen. Sunlight filtered through the banana leaves, casting soft, shifting patterns across their faces. And for just a brief moment, the weight lifted. There was only the taste of food and the warmth of shared silence. Nearby, the buffalo was tied at the edge of the field. James stood up, grabbed a knife, and began chopping bananas to feed it. The rhythmic sound of the blade hitting wood filled the quiet air. Diep watched him with open admiration. "You're amazing," she said brightly. "You learned so fast. You even plow better than me now." James laughed softly, shaking his head. Sweat dripped down his temple as he wiped his face with his sleeve. He handed her a bottle of water, then went back to cutting bananas, feeding the buffalo piece by piece, gently patting its neck. Diep joined him, helping tie the rope more securely. The buffalo let out a loud bellow, startling them both into laughter. The world felt small, peaceful, just rustling leaves, warm sunlight, and their voices blending together. And James felt it clearly. This was real life. Not meetings, not status, not money, care, sharing, presence. But when Diep turned away to gather more bananas, James watched her quietly. The joy on her face only deepened the conflict inside him. He loved her, loved this innocence, this life. But the truth about her mother lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. For a fleeting second, he wanted to tell her everything, confess, let the weight fall away. But fear won, fear of losing this closeness, this peace. So he stayed silent. His hands tightened around the rope as if grounding himself. When Diep returned, smiling as brightly as ever, unaware of the storm inside him, he matched her smile. Their bond grew deeper in that silence, and somehow even more fragile. As the afternoon light softened into gold, dust settled around them. The buffalo chewed contentedly, and in that quiet act of care, James felt something close to redemption. Brief, imperfect, but real. The countryside stretched endlessly, indifferent to his hidden burden. It offered him only the present moment, and for now, that was enough. Later, they sat together again, sharing the remaining bamboo shoots and rice that had cooled under the shade. Diep spoke excitedly about going deeper into the forest next time, about how difficult the path was and how long the walk would be, but how worth it felt. James nodded, promising to take her. His voice was warm, but his eyes drifted toward the fields, thoughtful. He thought of the life he'd stepped away from, even if only temporarily. The company, the employees, TET bonuses, endless calculations. Here, there were no numbers, only earth, sky, and Diep. Happiness felt vivid, almost too vivid, like something that could shatter if held too tightly. The secret about her mother sat quietly inside him, unchanged. A silent curse he carried alone. He knew that if the truth ever surfaced, everything they had could collapse in an instant. And yet, he chose to stay, to live here, to be happy now. Diep leaned her head against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They watched the sun sink slowly toward the horizon, painting the sky in soft oranges and purples. And in that stillness, James realized something. Happiness wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance and sacrifice. He gently squeezed her hand. Inside him, hope and regret existed side by side. Regret for the truth he concealed. Hope for more mornings like this, more sunsets, more shared silence. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of ripe rice and damp soil. Eventually, they stood and began leading the buffalo home. Their shadows stretched long across the field, merging as the light faded. This simple rural life had become a refuge for their love, even with the unspoken secret resting quietly behind it. As twilight deepened and the first stars appeared, they walked home together, each step steady, each moment borrowed. James carried both joy and burden in his chest, and he knew without doubt that this fragile peace, however temporary, was worth every hidden truth he bore alone.